You ready? So I met Ken Hough because he was the angel on my very first night tour. He was a fabulous angel, mainly because he has a doctorate in U.S. history, so he was able to give me all of the places where I was wrong. Which is a lot of fun, let me tell you. But not only was Ken a guide for 4 years, he also has a doctorate in U.S. history, and he likes the weird and the quirky parts of history. Hence, a great introduction into his subject, Hearst versus the Flying Saucers. So, Mr. Ken Hough.
Thank you. Don't clap yet. You haven't seen it. Decide whether or not this is worth your time. Hopefully it is. So, oh yeah, I went way too far into this subject matter. So, starting. I hope it's going to be. Oh, wrong slide. We'll get to that. All right. Yeah, I have way too many slides here too, so we'll just see.
Sound like a professor.
Yeah. Music we're hearing is from the day of your Switzerland. And there is sort of a first connection to that. But I think that this is kind of where's Mr. Hearst? There he is. What I had discovered doing this, and this was just a guess, that there would be something about flying saucers in the Hearst media at this time, because it sort of appealed to some of their demographic. And what I found out was just so many different interesting, weird kind of connections. One of the main things is that they try to maybe exploit or use the mass sightings that are happening in 1947. This is the first modern flying saucer wave. But Hearst and his media leaves its imprint on the phenomenon, even when they're trying to dismiss it eventually. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but I'm just going to do like a show and tell. That's kind of how it is. I could do it really academic, and I have some notes if you have any questions, but I'm just going to go based on the kind of the cool things that I found. So, and I got to play around with PowerPoint. Okay. So let's start here. This is way before 1947. This was actually a poem that was written in the early 1880s, 1882, if I'm not mistaken, by John T. Trowbridge. It's called Darius Green and His Flying Machine. So this is, we're talking 20 years before even the briefest of flights had happened. So this is a good reminder that even if the technology doesn't exist, there's generally a lot of speculation about it. And this was actually printed during a previous UFO flap in the 1890s in Hearst's San Francisco Examiner. So, but this is how it starts, right? It was the 4th of July, and the weather was dry, and not a cloud was on all the sky, save a few light fleeces, which here and there, half mist, half air, like foam on the ocean when floating by, think ships in the air, right? Just as lovely a morning as ever was seen for a nice little trip in a flying machine. So, we'll come back to this poem because there's some interesting things about it. But 4th of July, right? Let's see. There we go. Well, 4th of July, 1947. UFOs have been sighted. They're not called UFOs yet. They don't know what to call them. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there's one of the terms, flying disc, right? So basically, the end of June, stories start coming out. People are seeing things. And it's mostly, I want to make this clear, this is a newspaper phenomenon, largely. Unless you actually were one of the lucky people to see these things. Most everyone is just getting their information from the newspapers. It's not just Hearst, but in a little bit of comparison with some of his contemporary papers, which I'll show you some of that, definitely ran with the story during a slow kind of news moment. It was a holiday weekend, basically, and the New York Journal American basically says this was the deluge. This is when it really started. So there's a really interesting, and I have it over here, a couple of books that I brought with me. The black book in the center there was a media study done in the 1960s, just tracing the phenomena across American newspapers. And you'll see how, there are previous reports leading up, but once you get to July 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, that is the crest, basically, of the wave. So, and Hearst media is great. If, for anything, it's for its images of, trying to show how this is impacting the whole country. And it's really an interesting time, too, because there is this talk about, well, the war is over, how are we going to maintain this kind of defense, how are we going to maintain a certain unity on issues and whatnot, and maybe flying saucers is that kind of strange thing that can help do that. So this is the book I was referring to, Ted Blecker, a ufologist, I suppose. Basically, this is a guy who went he said that he was doing this for maybe 10, 15 years, but he went around the country and went into their newspaper archives. Most of these were not on microfilm yet. Now I can call a lot of these things up online, so it's very, very hard for you to do any of this kind of research, and he's just kind of plotting it. This is a bell curve that you see in a lot of different panics, right? You'll see a bell curve almost exactly like that when it comes to the 1929 stock market crash and the speculation in the crash. And I teach engineering ethics, and I talk about how the subjective can impact the objective. And there's an famous Isaac Newton quote where he says, "I can calculate the movement of stars and planets, but not the madness of men." Because he got sucked into one of these speculative bubbles as well too. Lost his whole family fortune doing that. So just kind of interesting. Yeah. So here's where the fever breaks, right? But at the height, you had about 160 sightings per day. So, yeah, this is 1947. So, and really, principally, we're talking about late June through about mid-July. There are some later reports as well too, but that was the height of it. I hope it doesn't anger you because there's more of those. Okay, so Blecker does an interesting thing too. Is he numbers the sightings, and some are minor, some are have a little bit more there, and you can track them across the newspapers and just see how the various different newspapers were reporting them. So this is actually two different sightings, but because they're happening at the same time, they're given two different numbers, but because you can kind of run them together, you have a former Marine pilot, and that's really big to the Hearst media, is talking about who are the authority figures on the flying saucers. It would be anybody who was in the military or was currently in the military, police officers, those with some kind of social standing in the society, that type of thing. So they seem to vet a little bit better. And of course, a lot of pilots are seeing the saucers, when they're in the air. This is a person who's on the ground, and he's talking about how there were, I think he says what he thought maybe 20 or more saucers just bouncing around and doing strange things. Didn't even really know what the shape was, although they are using the term disk, because disk was the first term that really sunk in. We'll talk about flying saucers in a moment where that comes from. But so he's seeing this in Portland, but they're also seeing this from International News Service Bureau headquarters. They're looking out the windows and they can see the same thing. And they see something. People don't really have the context to talk about exactly what it is. But I just thought that was interesting, is that they're talking about them as if they're animals too. That's another thing. It's like they look like birds. Lots of times they're described as like insects, something like that. So later the concept of it being intelligent life from outer space kind of takes hold. Let's look at the other media though a little bit. What are they talking about? So this is New York Times. I mean, the top stories you have there are my notes. Rent gouging. We don't talk about that anymore, do we? So there's a little editorial. We have to remind ourselves what the 4th is about. The nation has to be prepared to meet future perils. There's a strike going on, or the potential for a strike, a mine strike. Cold War, Cold War, Cold War, all over that. Truman is trying to rally Congress to give him funds to help support countries in need to fight the Russians. Gee.
Wow.
Yeah, like I said, this is this is part of it, doing this is so eerie, is that you say, oh, are we right back where we were before? No saucer stories in that entire issue. This is July 5th, right after the 4th, those sightings would have been reported. New York Times isn't touching it. It's not that they don't talk about them at the beginning and throughout, but this is the paper record, right? So they can't go there. How about the Journal American? Well, these are the top stories. You're going to notice this across all of these Hearst papers. They basically have very similar stories. This is interesting. You see how they have certain things that they want to talk about, promote, they want to report on, whatever they think is going to get people to buy papers. But there's a lot of regional variation, which is really fascinating. So it's kind of a little bit of both. You're part of a large entity, but you're talking about things in different ways. There is a king who had renounced his throne, who is about to get married to his lover, mistress originally, but now is going to be his wife, who's supposedly on her deathbed. I followed this story. She actually will live until 1977. He dies like 3 years later. So it's big news, right? Big news, right? That's right. Banner headline here. Here's talking about, and I apologize for some of the pictures. Some of them I was taking off a microfilm, and they just don't photograph very well, but you get a sense of things. A lot of the same things that were talked about maybe in the Times, but here we have a flying saucer story, right? And there's that map, which is, it will be used in various different Hearst papers. This is potentially the first picture of a flying saucer ever taken, and there's a Hearst connection to that as well. So, okay, LA Times. There's a huge saucer story right here, right? This is a couple days later, but this was a West Coast phenomenon, largely. That's the focus of it. That's where it kind of got started. And it seemed to be an enormous amount of interest. And so the Times is competing with some of Hearst's other papers. There's also stories about plane crashes, look at big images, so what is going to catch your eye? Here's the Herald Express, very different. Yes, oh yes.
Now, at the time, Ken, is the Times, are they the first one that used the term flying saucers?
No,
Okay.
no. I'm going to argue that it's the Hearst media. Actually, that's the term. So you see lots of pictures. This is much more of a working class paper. It's supposed to grab your attention. This is basically the same time period. They're even illustrating what they think it might look like if you got an up close view. We'll come back to that.
Neither of those are Hearst papers, right? We haven't seen.
This is a Hearst paper.
This is
Los Angeles Herald Express is a Hearst paper. You would say maybe skewing a little bit more towards a tabloid, a little bit. It's not exactly a tabloid, but it has that kind of sensibility. By the way, the one Hearst paper that's almost impossible to find is the Mirror. I've been trying to get microfilm copies through UCSB, and I just can't find it anywhere. So it's actually really hard to get the New York Journal American. It's just the way that it's coded in the catalog. So, okay, Times again, right? Another UFO story. That same picture. Here's the Examiner. So they have a kind of similarity in look. Hearst is promoting powerful military, powerful Navy again. But and it's also about kind of directing the eye as well too. You land on one side and the Italians are maybe in danger of going communist and we need to send them aid. On the other side, there's some random expert who did not want to be named from Caltech, who is claiming that these are atomic experiments going awry. So here's the San Francisco Examiner, very similar kind of layout and feel to it, and even some of the same stories. So now here's the Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, big headline, very strong anti-communism. Also talking about aviation. We're going to talk about a number of plane crashes that happen, both stunt pilots, but also just in military and commercial air traffic. No saucer stories in this paper. Compare that to the Chicago Herald American, and it's the biggest headline you can imagine, right? Flying discs right there. This is going to grab your attention and make you read it. And again, that photograph that keeps popping up. So, a couple of papers that I only found out, and I've been using newspaperarchives.com, that found out that they were actually scanned and that I could access them, which I didn't use very much in here. But one of them is the Oakland Post-Inquirer. and the other one is the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph. So they're kind of both kind of the same, again, working class kind of papers, big images, very loud type, definitely, and a lot of advertisements, mostly advertisements, I would say, in there. So making money off of advertisements. In some ways, I think this might be the perfect example of a Hearst paper from that era. You have patriotism with a great big image. Looks like something from the newsreels, right, in a sense. You have crime. There's a lot of crime stories, which we'll look at some of that. You have, talking about honoring veterans and honoring the war heroes. And you have that picture, again, not a great picture, never really was a good picture, even if you saw it up close, but that picture of potentially the first picture of flying saucers. So, and anti-communism as well, too. So, okay, case number 200. Some of these are just so strange. If I had all day, we could really dig into them. What I love about it is the variety of different reports. It's not just, which is fascinating, but it's not just the light in the sky, it's not a disk necessarily. Here they are talking about these flattened, upside down wash tubs, see? More like wash tubs and saucers. They glowed blue on the bottom, and they were as big as 2-story, 5-bedroom houses. And they fluttered to the ground like leaves into the trees, but then when they went, they couldn't see, there was nothing physical there anymore, And it was a mass sighting too. There were at least 20 people had seen this. So this photograph gets repeated quite a bit throughout the Hearst press.
I like the typo.
Where's the
Can
typo?
someone give me a room house? And each were as big as a give room house.
Oh
Is that
yeah,
a typo?
yeah.
What's this supposed to, 5, okay.
Yeah. So all right. I bought a book. I know it's dark in here, but there's a great book by Jack Womack. He is a collector of UFO ephemera. Doesn't believe in UFOs, but is interested in the cultural phenomenon of it. And this is from his book, and I used some of his pictures in there. So, but just a little bit on, as we've been talking, a little bit about the Hearst media, Hearst journalism in general. How does that, fit in? And very specifically, Hearst weird journalism. It's a big part of something I don't think has been researched, really looked at very much. But it's something that a lot of people are probably buying his papers on certain days, and certainly to read about. So we'll talk about the 1896, 1897 airship wave, and certainly go more in depth into the 1947 first wave, and then how that, both the wave and the way that it was reported, has an impact on the flying saucer myth or the flying saucer experience, or however you want to talk about it. I was watching something recently, and they're talking about how this UFOs, the more modern term, I guess UAPs, has become almost like a world religion without the trappings of religion. So it's something, it's an interesting social bonding kind of experience for a lot of people. So I don't want to suggest, I don't have any answers, really, honestly. All I have, I'm just a historian, just kind of going through the documents and seeing how they talked about it every time. So this was, my speaker went out, so it's wondering why. This is my childhood. I don't know. Number 2 most important movie of 1977. Star Wars being the first. Close Encounters. Doing this project, I felt like I was walking in Steven Spielberg's footsteps because you can see where he got the ideas from. That's always that song has been in my head also. Yes, and yeah, it is very cathartic, right? I feel like I'm Gen X, and I got set up for this. From the very get-go, we were told saucers were real, and just lived it, And maybe as a historian or any kind of researcher, you exercise your demons, right? By doing the research, like, why do I believe this? Where did this come from? So, well, part of where it came from was my parents. My father wrote a book about flying saucers and other phenomena connected to the Air Force. He was a radar navigator, nuclear weapons officer during the later part of the Cold War, flew on the B-52 bombers, and hates the fact that I'm using that photograph of him. It was the biggest mustache that they would let them grow. But they had to allow them to have facial hair because it was the 70s, and otherwise you would stand out like a sore thumb, I guess. My mother actually has the better UFO sighting. She was in Ecuador at the time. She was at a friend's house somewhere out in the countryside, and she said, and I grew up hearing this story over and over and over again, but a white light, they all of a sudden saw it like out in the distance on part of this ranch where there were no cars, there's no roads, nothing like that, and they climbed up on the wall. Everybody at this party, it was a mass sighting, there might have been 10 to 15 people there, and all of a sudden it flashed a very bright light at them, all of the people, and it flew up into the sky, you know, and just kind of freaked her out. So again, this is where I get it from, right? Comic books, and of course, even as a young man, you know, the X-Files and how that kind of, you know, spun into the government is hiding something, right? And boy, it just keeps following us around, right? This year, there was a major UFO flap. You know, maybe not called that necessarily, but certainly a lot of speculation. Congress is studying all kinds of new agencies, weird agencies being formed. Sketchy characters talking about non-human biologics being alien bodies, you know. Alongside respected naval pilots saying, you know, this is, you know, and the footage that they're releasing. So I don't know what it means. I really don't know what it means, but except that we're still fascinated by it. It's still part of our world. Okay, so I mentioned weird studies. This is, I think, I've finally come to the sense that that's what I do. You know, I am a historian. I have studied kind of cultural phenomena, so I'm a cultural historian definitely. But I really kind of skew into that which you can never really get to the bottom of. You can't really explain it completely. You know, there's never going to be, you never find that perfect government document or whatever it is that's going to explain everything. So just having to kind of deal with the existential crisis of it all. I follow Mark Fisher. I won't talk too much about this, but he wrote a book a few years ago talking about the weird and the eerie, and he's no longer with us, but he wrote about the economy. He was a literature critic and whatnot. But he's saying the weird is that which intrudes on the normal. And it's kind of like the outside world, or some outside entities coming in and making a mess of normality, right? And basically suggesting you don't know it all. And for that reason, it can be a little scary. It's usually not terrifying. I like what he says, it's generally more stupefying. You know, what is going on? Like, where is this coming from, right? The eerie is either the absence of something that should be there, or the presence of something that shouldn't be there. So they kind of come together in some ways. Right? I definitely think that this is a weird topic, obviously. And there's Womack's book, which is a great, just kind of a catalog of how the UFO myth grows over time. So, what's in a name, right? This is great. Part of when I was conceiving this talk, I was thinking of how my guides use this. If anything, just in your research, learn the lingo that they were using back in the time period that you're searching, and sometimes it'll get you where you're going a lot faster. I went into this thinking, well, UFO I know came out in the 50s sometime. That probably wasn't the term of art. Flying saucers must be it. And that is true. It's there from nearly the beginning. But flying saucers is the number 2 most popular term. Flying discs. Everybody's talking about flying discs. I mean, now there is a disagreement over whether it's C or K, and that's some regional variation. Sometimes in the same story, they spell it 2 different ways. You know, some of these are being rushed out there, but these are all these other, you know, terms: aerial discs, weird discs, mystery discs, missiles, whatsits, sky whizzers, flying pie plates, pie pan affairs, right? But flying saucers, according to Mr. Womack, who has been collecting and studying this subject for 40 years, this is the first use of the term flying saucers, and it was an unnamed INS wire reporter who just slapped the title on there. It does come from Kenneth Arnold, who was the one who kind of got famous for seeing these. He did not call them flying saucers. He said that they were crescent-shaped craft that skipped across the air like a saucer would if you were skipping it across the water. And then that was taken and was used in a lot of different versions. But he sees what he thinks he sees on the 24th of June. On the 25th, it gets picked up by a local paper in Oregon, and then goes out over the AP wire, but it doesn't have the name to it yet. And so it's some, you know, anonymous person in the Hearst organization who gives it the name flying saucer. So at least you got that, right? You got something out of this, that flying saucer. Now, Edward Ruppelt, who will take over, he'll be the director of Project Blue Book, which you may have heard of, was not the first, but it was kind of the premier organization within the Air Force to study the phenomenon and actually treat it somewhat seriously, he proposed giving it a different name, unidentified flying objects, because he thought, well, flying saucer sounds childish. It sounds like it's supposed to be dismissed. And I think that that's a lot of how the media was using it, including the Hearst media. This is a childlike term, it's silly. This whole thing is it's a silly and weird experience, so it kind of fits with that. He proposed not UFO, which is how most of us say it, if we do say this, but he said it's unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Yeah, he says that over and over again in his book, The Report on UFOs. Right? So UAP is a modern term. I think a lot of the naming is important because it's about trying to get your hands around the issue. If you can give a label to something, if you can give a name to something, you have a little bit of control. But over something that is uncontrollable, that's another thing that Fisher talks about the weird is, there's all this talk in the 40s and into the 50s about containment, like containment of communism and whatnot, and this does get linked to it. But this is that which cannot be contained, right? You can't touch it, you can't see it. In some cases, you can photograph it. So, some of my sources, I've used this extensively. This is the closest thing to time travel, I would say, and it's searchable now. So it's just fantastic, and there's more and more papers coming online. They don't have everything, but there's a lot. There's San Francisco Examiner, its whole run is in there, and I did mention those other two Hearst newspapers that I discovered. A lot of what I have, and the account for my terrible pictures, are from microfilm, and I was saving time. I was just using my phone, taking the photographs, so they're not like book ready or anything like that. But this, if you don't know about this source, I'll have a few clips from the Hearst Metrotone News, or News of the Day, as it was in 1947. And that's the second closest, or maybe that is the closest, those things in tandem to time travel. It's just watching a Hearst newsreel from that period, sometimes you realize, I'm in a different world. This is not a world that exists anymore. It's like watching a completely different culture. So, just a lot of different, you have so much access to documentation of various different stripes. Sometimes if I'm just looking for the cover of a Cosmopolitan, you can find it on eBay. Or Heritage Auctions has original artwork and a lot of unusual things there. The Black Vault, well, that's, that there was a sighting at the castle, and this is supposedly where it came from, although it's not there anymore. I was hoping Chuck Walker would, tell us where he got this information exactly, because there is that document that we'll look at. But they do have other documents that I found there, including some pertaining to Walter Winchell, which were kind of fascinating. So yeah, there's Blecker's book. Lantern is great. It's insider or industry magazines having to do with entertainment, radio, television, movies, whatnot. So there's a lot. There's a lot of good stuff out there. That's where I got most of my information from. Okay, so back to Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Like I said, seems to be, at least from that time period, like this perfect example of what you could expect from a Hearst newspaper at that point in time. Let's go back to the Daily Examiner, right? When it was something that George Hearst had purchased and was hoping to help him with his political career. This is from Cora Older's book. I think it's just a pertinent quote, right? What do I know about running a newspaper? It's about as much as the man from the moon. So, yeah.
Right. This was just, you were going over instances and all that kind of stuff. Did you give anything from, I know it's not necessarily respected, but
Yeah.
it is a Hearst paper, the Weekly World News.
It's the American Weekly. It's American Weekly. Yeah. There are some American weeklies. That's the weirdest of the weird.
Yeah.
It's great. Is it? I always think, why was Hearst against marijuana? Because that's the only way you can really enjoy these stories. And you get so sucked into them. And that's another way to kind of look at the UFO wave. It almost feels like the entire population of the United States got dosed by LSD. It kind of feels like that. Or it was almost like a permission to be weird, a permission to be silly in some ways. So anyway, the story. Takes over the paper in 1880, and then he's got a political career, so he hands it over to the board, right? So, and Andy Hamp put this together. This is a map of Hearst's media empire circa 1935 from Fortune magazine. Andy added the helpful annotations here. So this is at the height of his media holdings, but it's also when he's being attacked from the leftists and from other points of view as being too political and not necessarily objective, and so we'll take his name eventually off of the newsreels and whatnot, and then the depression will catch up with him when he'll start to sell things off. So what did he do? 28 newspapers at the height, 13 magazines. I think Andy said 8 to 10 radio stations. We'll start divesting himself of radio stations in the post-war era when he's made a recovery, but they will still be around. They will still be around. That may be the most ephemeral because most of those programs don't exist. It's kind of hard to find those that are not genre programs necessarily. So yeah, here's the papers that I looked at. That Hearst Eagle. You can see it kind of jumps out at you. I think in ’47 he had 17 papers, I believe. And there were other, here's American Weekly that you were talking about. I love this advertisement, the 12 basic human interests. It's very scientific, the way that they laid it out there. So, INS is the news service. So you'll see INS stories in non-Hearst papers or papers where they might have had some kind of partnership. Trying to figure out exactly how that works is daunting, and it's not exactly my forte. But sometimes when you search the title of a story, you'll see it on that newspaper archives. You'll see that same story pop up in a non-Hearst newspaper. So it makes you wonder, And of course, they're just trying to fill space and time. And so if it's coming off INS, sometimes they just slap it right in there. News of the Day, of course, this is newsreels. Cosmopolitan later on will publish a very negative story about wasting taxpayer dollars studying UFOs. And just a year after this is when television becomes part of the Hearst media landscape. So, muckraking sensationalist. So not just a muckraker and not just a sensationalist, but running these two things together. So this is the era of the yellow journals, right? There's a lot of different terminology for this. This was an article written by a history of journalism professor saying that Hearst's muckraking, which is generally talking about society's ills, it took a much more sensationalistic approach than most other sources. They all were trying to pull on your heartstrings or punch you in the stomach with how gross something was, but just Hearst seemed to take it to another level, and also wasn't as concerned with facts or getting everything 100% right, or having the sources presented. Where did you get this information from? Often somewhat melodramatic, often attacking his political enemies. Of course, this is early 1900s to maybe about 1914, 1915, so just around the time of World War I. The public will soon lose its appetite for this kind of storytelling, and that's actually going to change the Hearst media somewhat. But those big banner headlines never completely go away, obviously. So, yeah, you know this story, right? Running with a story before you know exactly what has happened, but mainly because you'll be first and because it's going to sell papers. I mean, we still live in that world today. So, yeah, there were no Spanish ships on our coast. It was very, very likely not destroyed by a Spanish mine, so all of these things. But, that's a long time ago. Hearst liked humor. He liked mirth. He liked pranks. Not on him, right? But he liked hearing it. He liked things that were funny. He liked clowns, right? I mean, here are two Castle guests, right? He liked the kind of in-your-face luridness of the cartoon, right? And so that's definitely a part of the flying saucer experience as well, too. So there's something about it where in the midst of, we just went through the World War, now we have to deal with nuclear weapons, and that, all that entails, the encroachment of communism and whatnot. And in this little moment, you talk about something that is almost akin to fairies or ghosts, or something that everybody is seeing. So here's some weird journalism. Some of it is just the way that it's constructed. So if you look at this looks like a giant condor, an enormous condor that's being lassoed. It's actually the perspective that's being created, but that's a large part of how the stories were kind of drawing you in. The visual, the movement. It feels cinematic in some ways. So, and hired some of the best illustrators. Here's maybe the first UFO-like sighting that I could find in the Hearst media. San Francisco Examiner, this is 1898 is the sighting, and was reported in early 1899. So suddenly stars shot off at different angles, following each other in quick succession. And what they didn't know what to make of it, but here they're talking, as if it was, soldiers on drill or something like that. Again, sometimes we have a tendency to put a label to something or put an explanation to something based on what we know. So, what were they thinking about in 1898? In some of these early encounters, they're thinking about America's role in the world and the new dangers of mechanized warfare. So, lots of interesting characters pop up. This is 1901. Camille Flammarion, and this is the San Francisco Examiner. Flammarion was an astronomer, but also a science fiction writer. So there's a lot of crossover at that time. Mm-hmm. He was probably the first to suggest that a comet could destroy the world. Talked about poisonous gases a lot, and that might have had an impact on later science fiction stories. So and here he is just talking about that we will probably within 50 years. So 1901, within 50 years, we'll know if there's life on other planets, and we'll be talking to them. Maybe, the technology has advanced, right? Here is someone. This is Isaac K. Funk, who was the Funk in Funk and Wagnalls. So he's a millionaire who, at the end of his life, got really interested in seances, got duped by some famous frauds. But here is writing about what's life after death going to be like, and I don't know if you can see this, but it's a trail of ghosts. It's our spirits that are flying to these other planets, and he thinks that if he gets a good enough telescope, he can see our spirits flying through the galaxy. So astral projection in 1909. This is a great. Okay, what is life? Or what do people look like on Mars? Right. So there's a lot going on here. Strange alien elephant kind of type. They talk about some of this. There's some science to this because Hugo Gernsback, he had a lot of these scientific journals. They preceded things like Popular Mechanics and whatnot. But he was also who started Amazing Stories. So he made the leap from the pure science into science fiction. Look at these things. This is 1919. These look a lot like flying saucers to me. It's very strange. They don't explain it in this image, like what exactly are we looking at. So, here's another, just interesting characters that pop up. This is 1925, and Isabella Lewis was one of the most celebrated women in American astronomy at that time. She was, I think, one of the first to be admitted to the major astronomical groups. And this article is exobiology, basically talking about, well, what we know about Mars now, what would that mean if there actually was life on Mars, and what would it look like? So it's a very speculative science, but it's an attempt to guess at what the reality might be. So, and see how this image, or this idea of life on other worlds, Mars particularly, but it sticks around in the Hearst media, era after era after era. So you may know that Cosmopolitan, before Hearst owned it, was the first in the United States to serialize War of the Worlds. So about 10 years or more before he actually purchased it. And of course, H.G. Wells would be a guest at the castle. Victorian sci-fi is largely, obviously War of the Worlds is a little different, but largely it's kind of optimistic about the new technology that's coming along. And of course, talking about internal combustion engine. I have this whole list of all of the different types of technology. Telephone is 1876, gramophone 1877, light bulb 1879, motor car 1884, X-rays 1895, radio 1896, Zeppelins 1900. It's one thing after another where the science fiction is proposing it and it's coming to pass. And it's kind of heady and exciting for people, but also there's this sense for a lot of people that it's going too fast, right? What is it going to mean for the human species in some ways? And then I discovered this. This was one of the last Jack London stories that was ever published. 1918 is published. He dies in 1916. He wrote this, I think, in January or February 1916, convalescing in Hawaii, and he'll be dead by November of that year. It's called The Red One, and it's in Cosmopolitan from 1918. This is when Hearst owns it. It's a very problematic story, and there's a lot of racial politics that, obviously would make us blanch today. Although it's almost like London kind of coming to grips with his racism in some ways. I'll let you read it, and you can make up your own mind. But what it is, it's about an explorer who goes looking for a giant butterfly that's supposed to have a foot wingspan. He's in the Solomon Islands, where London actually visited, and loses that quest very quickly. It's almost like he's looking for a fairy or a fabled creature, and instead discovers that there are natives there that are worshiping a giant red orb that seems to have crashed or been there for eons. In fact, it's been dug out of the ground with primitive tools, and they worship it like a god. It is possibly the first ancient aliens science fiction story. The term itself wasn't even really conceived of until 1919 by Charles Fort. If you know Charles Fort at all. So very strange things so it's, like I said, an interest in some ways of the Hearst media. Okay, so obviously he had an interest in aviation. He was talking about the Wright brothers' first flight, and then very quickly selling it to the U.S. government. Right, this is how they stayed afloat. They showed that it could be a tool of warfare. Here's Hearst, right, in 1910, flying near Tanforan. Look at the smile on his face. Exactly, right? Yeah, this is exciting to him. He sees the future. He's a part of it in some ways, right? And so he's definitely going to be promoting it, for various ends. Before that, though, like I said, there was this early UFO flap, the airship wave, where started in Sacramento, I believe. The Call, which was a newspaper that was a competitor of Hearst's, reported people, sometimes prominent people in the city, seeing, well, what is it? Something looking sort of like a dirigible, somewhat cigar-shaped, sometimes flapping wings on the side, had an undercarriage with very powerful, supposedly very powerful spotlights shining down. Some people said that they would yell up and they'd say, "Where are you going?" "Oh, we're going to make San Francisco by noon," or whatever. All of these sightings, and they generally were at night. And Hearst completely lambasts them in the San Francisco Examiner. Says they're just a bunch of hoaxers. They're running this story that there's no truth to it. Here he is going after the publisher of the Call, and these jokes that he makes on it. Here's someone who's gone crazy from too much airship, right? He's committed to an asylum because of it. I mean, mainly talking about it as a nuisance. And most of the other San Francisco papers and around there were kind of on Hearst's side. In fact, you'll see sometimes they'll print Hearst's editorial. Here it is. This is a Hearst editorial, but it's printed in the McClatchy papers. So, yeah, you can see this puncturing, whatever this airship thing is. However, on the East Coast, Hearst is going to have a different story. Orville Wright, 1947, still alive. Very similar to what Hearst is arguing in 1896, that this is a hoax that has been promoted by those who want to make money off of it. They're seeking power or attention in some ways. So in this case, I think it's very disingenuous of Orville Wright, because that's how the Wright brothers stayed in business, by selling their planes as a war machine in some ways. Here he's saying it's military pork. But Jimmy Swinnerton makes a cartoon. Stayed at the Castle, one of Hearst's favorite artists. Here, these are kind of local San Francisco characters. One of them was the former Attorney General of California, claimed to represent the inventor of these airships. There's always a mysterious inventor at this time, and he said that. In one statement that he made to the press, a man named Hart, he said, "We could take these airships and we could go destroy the Spanish in Cuba." And this is Butcherweiler, right, being attacked by that. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting how Hearst turns his, the ability to kind of create graphic images to his own devices. So this is the New York Journal. suggesting that this is a real occurrence. This is the other major paper that he owned. So 2 different coasts, 2 different stories. Hearst never explained why on the West Coast he thought it was a con, and on the East Coast he said that it happened. Maybe he just understood the audiences differently. Who knows? But when I looked at this, the first time I saw this, I thought, I've seen that before. Oh yeah, it's like a real UFO, right? The technology changes, the concepts of what it can do potentially, pretty much kind of the same. So, all right. Okay, and then here's Darius Green and his flying machine. So this is a big spread talking about other attempts at flying. This is still 1896, so it hasn't happened. It's mostly those who have tried and crashed and died and whatnot. Darius Green is so great. It's this little poem, and it's about a kid who's basically being bullied by his older brothers, and he says, I'm going to show them, and I'm going to show the whole town. I'm going to build a flying machine. I'm going to fly over the 4th of July celebrations, and I'm going to scare the wits out of them. Right? He even says, I'm going to take to the air, just the same way that a ship would. And he says, I'm going to fly over the celebration. I'll flop up to the windows and scare the people. Right? And give them a good scare, mischievous scare, not too bad. And they're going to make them believe I'm the man from the moon. That's 1882, but reprinted by her saying, we've been talking about this before. These are popular notions that are existing. So here in 1937, we're getting close to probably a well-known scare that you've heard of. So this is the year before. There's that Flammarion's idea of poisonous gases flying through the universe, and that might imperil the Earth. Now it's the blue dust storms of planet Mars that maybe get off planet Mars and poison us. Reprinting images from H.G. Wells here. 1937, here is Salvador Dali for American Weekly. So what is that? I mean, he calls it, I think he says a flying cucumber or something like that. So, it's supposed to be it's called The Conquest of the Air, was this piece, and it's the positives but also the negatives. This is clearly supposed to be some kind of militaristic, thing. Of course, we're right on the cusp of World War II, and already cities are being bombed from the air. So, and then these are those who have the pioneers of the air who may have died in their attempts to. Sorry, that's so goofy. Same issue, the San Francisco Examiner. Now, American Weekly is a standalone kind of insert, but same issue. You're reading about attacks from the air. Now it's Japan. How could Japan assail the West Coast? So this is well before, obviously, World War II. It's basically drawing on what has Japan been doing in China. So you can see, the future of Los Angeles if Japan attacks. They have these very detailed maps. It's like a comic, but it's also news, sort of, right? Just imagining how terrible things will be. This is one of Hearst's hobby horses, was the defenseless coasts, and also plugs into his yellow peril kind of fears. But you have sort of news and art and just imagination all kind of crossing over in these things. And of course, so right before Halloween in 1938. Orson Welles shows how, the dangers, really. I mean, that's what he argued. This is supposed to show some of the dangers of mass media, of how these ideas could disseminate. And so, you have, there's a guy running in, saying, where are my gas masks? We've just been gassed, And Hearst is suggesting throughout this, kind of gently in some ways, in other places, that it's dangerous. Remember, he owned radio stations, so he didn't want to do away with radio. But suggesting that maybe they should self-police. Maybe there should be better rules in place. Otherwise, you're going to completely sully this type of media. And of course, you know what happens. Wells becomes, at first he's excoriated, here's a guy who scared the nation, all of that, and he's biting his lips so that he doesn't smile, because he thinks it's all very funny. Then he gets a brand new contract. Campbell Soup sponsors the Mercury Theater. And his rise to fame just starts, and eventually he will make Citizen Kane, in part by some of the pushback that he got from the Hearst media over this. One of the things, this is another thing too, is this kind of worry that if we let our imaginations run away with us too much, Europe is going to use that against us. And here he's talking about England, But the Germans and the Japanese and the likely enemies, right? They were also kind of paying attention to this as well too. I think Hitler actually did mention the world's radio broadcast in his speech, talking about how weak the United States was. Hearst, though, is totally fine with using the radio to for sensational reasons. This crazy hoopla. I'm just trying to imagine this. Okay, so it's election night. He's saying, okay, you'll listen to us on the radio. You'll get our up to the minute, or I don't know how many editions of the newspapers will be printed. But all you have to do is go outside, and you will see Army bombers flying over the city of San Francisco. And if you see green bursts, that means that it is Smith has won. And if it's red bursts, then that means it's Hoover's won. And if it's a white burst, that means that it's undecided. And can you imagine, like, red, green, which one? They don't have the color coding down for the different parties yet, right? And maybe you didn't get any of this information, and so you're walking outside, and all of a sudden there's this burst in the air, and Army bombers flying over. I mean, somewhat irresponsible, maybe. Maybe this is just between the wars kind of experience, but like I said, yeah, searchlights flying everywhere. Yeah. And then we get to World War II, right? So Hearst was, according to Marion, you can decide whether or not the times we had is incontrovertible proof, but Hearst was in Los Angeles during the Battle of Los Angeles, which was probably the most famous non-event in U.S. history, at least up to that point in time. I did meet a man who claimed that his father was an engineer working for Vultee, which was a small aircraft company at the time, smaller than any of the bigger ones, claimed that a Japanese airplane had been shot down flying over the city. How did it get there? Well, there were Japanese submarines cruising up and down the coast that carried small reconnaissance planes within them. The Japanese never admitted to it. They said they never did it. A lot of their records from the war were lost. The Army said there were 5 planes definitely over the city. The Navy, Frank Knox, who had worked for Hearst before, who was now Secretary of the Navy, said there were no planes over the city. And they're both yelling at each other back and forth as to whatever the reality is, and then the war kind of moves on, and people kind of forgot about it. So, but for a lot, it was this sense of maybe this, we're just going to panic ourselves to death in some ways. Famous photographs of it. This is heavily airbrushed. How it got into the papers. So the actual photographs are a lot less telling. They don't really show very much. What was it? Clouds, birds, balloons, civilian planes, U.S. military planes that got shot by friendly fire. We'll probably never know necessarily, but it's generally considered kind of like a pre-version of the 1947 flag in some ways. And then the Foo Fighters during World War II, where sometimes on bombing missions, American pilots, but also in the other nations as well too, they would see strange lights. This is from the San Francisco Examiner, the firebombing of Japan, of Tokyo, and they said that they saw 8 balls of fire, one of them paralleling their course. They just assumed that they were Japanese jet planes, which they had been working on, but they weren't flying at the time. They didn't have any kind of sizable force. So what was it that they were seeing? It is the heat of battle, so who knows? Who knows what the mind will allow.
It wasn't during the Lewis impulse of fire.
Yeah, it's a common phrase. In fact, a lot of the flying saucer sightings are not saucers. They talk about the fiery balls. They keep saying it over and over again. I guess a generation without the that kind of sense of how this could be twisted. But ghost rockets preceded the flying saucer wave in the United States, mostly in the Nordic countries, Sweden and around. They believed that the Russians, that was their claim, that the Russians were firing captured German V weapons at them, but they never found anything. So, but it was happening over and over again. It was picked up by the U.S. media. The Japanese had sent over the first intercontinental ballistic, not missiles, but weapons. They discovered the jet stream, and they launched thousands of these fire balloons. They were large balloons that basically had grenade-like bombs at the bottom, and they would fly across the Pacific Ocean, and they are still finding them. They found some in British Columbia, I think about 4 years ago. Most of them probably never made it here and crashed in the ocean, but they got hung up in forests. Some of them came down near LA. I know some came down near Goleta as well too. So another thing I would say is that people were told to look up. Look up, right? Look for the enemy. They're coming over. And so more people were staring at the sky, World War II and afterwards, than they had before. Look at the juxtaposition here. As I talked about that before. So here we have the Nazis were going to build a plane to bomb New York. Here we have there are communist strikes or communist provocation happening in parts of Europe that had recently been at war, and maybe the United States needs to take a role in it. Here we have new atomic tests. They're talking about, and you've seen some of this imagery later on, where they'll drop it in the middle of these World War II hulks, animals being mutated by nuclear experiments, right? And then a Russian V-bomb. This is one of those ghost rocket sightings, that they're talking about. So it's like getting you into his ecosystem or his worldview, right? Which story is going to draw you in? Well, the photograph will probably get you, but if you're interested, I want to read more about those ghost rockets. Well, maybe it'll draw you into this whole thing. Somehow it's all kind of linked. Donald Kehoe. We'll get to him, who he is a little bit more, but he was one of the first to write about this in a very serious way. And I love this statement he makes. It's like if they are from outer space, right? They have no idea what's going on here. Right? We don't know what's going on here. There's so much turmoil, right? Maybe they don't want to visit us. Maybe they came and they said, "Oh, but no thanks," right? Yeah, exactly. Right? A-bombs and jet bombs and germ warfare and strikes and espionage. Just think of the long list of the stuff that we complain about. But he's saying, we need to treat this as seriously. And it was True magazine, which is kind of almost like a life magazine. It was true, like the stories were true, right? That's why this actually it drew a lot of people in, saying they don't publish lies, right? They publish things that are verifiable. And it was on the newsstands in December of 1949, even though it has a January 1950 cover. Where's Hearst? We know this. He's starting to draft his will. He's thinking about holding his media empire together. That's the spring of 1947. He isn't retired though. He's still poring over the papers. He's still kind of controlling the narrative. He's still trying to orchestrate, how the stories play out. Maybe it's a suggestion here and there, or even just the arrangement or whatever it is. He's very much concerned with what goes on in his papers, and we all know the story about his campaign against dirty literature. Here's one of the political cartoons that's about that. The smear book, the hate book, the obscene book, right? We need to clean up our act, right? So May, he will leave San Simeon for the last time, but it's not until October. It's not until October that at least his secretary says that he has to step away from really working, supervising all of the editorials. He still will be plugged in somewhat after that. Obviously, he's slowing down quite a bit, but that UFO wave, June, July, maybe some kind of cleanup in August. So he's still kind of paying attention. Oh yeah. Okay. So this is the first UFO song. This is also fascinating. You're like, what type of? There's so much new kind of popular music of that era, jazz and country swing and whatnot. The first is kind of a gospel song.
You better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers. It may be the coming of the judgment day. It's a sign, there's no doubt, of the trouble that's about. So I say, my friends, you'd better start to pray. They're a terrifying sight as they fly on day and night. It's a warning that we'd better mend our ways. You'd better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers. It may be the coming of the judgment day.
July 16th, 1947. They're the first to record and you can dial it up online if you want to. So here's a radio. Like I said, Hearst had as many as 10 potentially radio stations. In 47, these are the 4 that he has left. So a lot of the programming is not produced by him. He's actually part of the Mutual Network, and ABC is part of that as well too. And there's a lot of sharing of programs, but lights out. Scary OTR, with OTR radio. There's a lot of great Halloween type radio that's available now. So Walter Winchell. This is the Slow Tribune, just kind of showing you the different programs. You can see Walter Winchell. Well, I'll talk more about Walter Winchell. Apparently, according to Gabler's book, a lot of people listened to him. He was a huge chunk of the country. Had this enormous rating. A lot of people they listened to him because it was just kind of a guilty pleasure, because everybody else was listening at the time. And so it was almost like, I don't want to listen because it's kind of gross, kind of dirty, makes you feel weird, but it's interesting, or it's going to pass the time in some ways. Yeah, world of 47, radio's still king. More people, but television is coming, right? Yeah, brand new televisions. You can, put your $400 down, which is a big chunk of change in 1947.
That's a lot.
That's for inflation. That's why maybe $350 a week is a little bit better. But dig deep, because this baby has a 23 square inch screen. That's about 4.5 inches. Right? Yeah, 23 square inch. But it's coming, right? The television's coming, and in the next year, here's Hearst talking about. It's got a little cut off here, but you can see these are the television stations. One that he owns, but others that he's doing business with, and he's feeding them stuff. They need content, right? Feed them, and mostly news content. This is one of the stations in LA that had Hearst material on it. This is the full listing of programs for that week, right? Some in 1948 they might, or 47 they might have, like 2 or 3 programs on in an entire day. And within a few years, you'll go from maybe several thousand sets across the country to tens of thousands and millions eventually, as the technology got better and people were more used to it, and eventually. Hearst also had a deal with Dumont, which is the Lost Network, right? ABC, NBC, CBS. Dumont dumped apparently most of their archives in the Hudson River, because nobody wanted to take care of it. So Hearst will also have a connection to Telenews, which started before him. But his company will eventually buy it, and just kind of run with that. But we find this baffle the nation. All right, gas is 23 cents a gallon, right? So, and they're complaining about how it's the highest it's ever been. There are new cars, but a lot of what they were talking about was there won't be any new amenities. Not really, not anything new that you had. Any different than what you had gotten before the war, because they're just retooling these industries that have been making military equipment. So this is before tail fins and all of that type of thing. But more people are thinking about driving. People are thinking about what's in the air in 1947. Humphrey Bogart saying, it's moisturized. What kills Humphrey Bogart? Smog so bad in LA you couldn't see the buildings. Yeah, very, very bad. In 1944, there was a bad smog day in LA that they thought the Japanese had gas bombed them because people were getting sick. Some people died. There were people who died in some of these industrial cities at this time from the smog, right? We're using DDT on our roaches, right? Here they are, DDT being sprayed on kids on the beach. That's the past is a different country. It's the era of film noir, right? And I'm contemplating doing a Hearst and noir because that's a whole different thing, but there are a lot of connections. Brute Force is a film, one of the great noirs from 47, produced by Mark Hellinger. Hellinger had been a Hearst reporter and was working with Ben Hecht and others, so who obviously is kind of connected to this whole thing. Here's Citizen Kane, is kind of an early version of film noir. Noir, like the Flying Saucers in a different way, kind of spoke to people who had their eyes opened by the reality of human cruelty, of what they saw during the war, a suspicion of the government, a suspicion of supposedly the American dream in some way. It's very dark. It can be very existential. The universe doesn't really care about you, and it will do very strange things. And so it will really get going, in the post-war era. 47 is kind of starting to reach its stride, and it seems to have an impact on the UFO myth. There are stories just percolating around this time. This is one from the Chicago Herald American from July 9th, talking about Roswell, and here it is. One of the guys saying, it was a Marcel, who was from the Air Force at the Roswell field there, and a man in civilian clothes who Brazil was unable to identify. So all these talk about government agents or some kind of strange agents showing up and harassing people, taking their photographs, telling them not to talk about UFO stories. There are FBI agents running around, mostly worried about could the UFO community or whatever, the people who believe these things, could this be a vector for subversive attitudes, alien ideologies, that type of thing? Worried about, there's all kinds of worries about spies, and of course in 1947 they have no idea if the Russians are involved in these things that they're seeing, and so it probably all kind of goes through the folkloric mill, and becomes the Men in Black, and they weren't Will Smith and his partner in those fun movies. These are pretty dark, kind of scary kind of characters, that it seemed like. So it goes along with all the distrust. Crime, rampant crime, seemingly, at least if you read the newspapers, right? So this here is Bugsy Siegel with a gunshot wound, being lying dead, and a helpful arrow to show you where he was shot, whether he came in the window, right? There are all kinds of astonishing crimes. Here is the heiress to a furniture store fortune, or maybe they made furniture, factory furniture, who dynamited her parents maybe to get at the family fortune, although she was acquitted of the crime. But the flying saucers kind of chase some of these stories off, and then they kind of vie for their attention and whatnot. But yeah, this is my favorite. This is from Ben Hecht's book, The Child of the Century. They're talking about, not just him in Hollywood, but before that when he was a reporter. And he's talking about Arthur Pegler. Pegler was the one who kind of created the Sturm und Drang kind of style of the Hearst papers, saying a Hearst newspaper is like a screaming woman running down the street with her throat cut. And that's what the story should sound like. Kind of dark. And, well, this is Black Dahlia, right? That's January of 1947. These papers are extremely hard to find. I was able to get them through UCSB, through a microfilm. They keep going missing from lenders, so they're sometimes somewhat reluctant to lend them because there's a lot of people who have maybe too strong connection or affinity for studying this case or whatnot. But the Los Angeles City Public Library doesn't have their microfilm anymore because they've been stolen. And they've replaced it once or twice, but it's been stolen, also defaced. So this is Examiner. Front page photo, they did nicely add a airbrush blanket because that was not there. So, yeah. This is, even worse, is the Herald Express, right? And you can see how it's been defaced here. It's a gory, horribly gory photo, a little bit of airbrushing there, but not very much. And they, the Herald Express tried to call the Black Dahlia murderer the werewolf. So there was a lot of occultism too. A lot of countries after the war, Germany, Japan, and whatnot, are talking about their version of kind of folklore, and it's often kind of a return to witches and ghosts and monsters and that kind of thing. So it's in the news. Slow, right? This is happening right in the middle of that flying saucer wave. In fact, in this very issue, I think it's actually below the fold, they have a few flying saucer stories and sightings that were happening there. So yeah, crime wave, freedom for Ukraine. Wow. It's so eerie, right? Eerie. Like, why is it we're having this discussion again? I like how this is addressed to Hearst in San Simeon, even though this is July. So people are not aware that he's left, or that he's not coming back. So, and of course, that's, talking about the Russian threat. A lot of what's going on in the Hearst media and will continue to ramp up is a hunt for subversives in the United States, especially Westbrook Pegler, who was the son of Arthur Pegler, the quote that we just read. They will give information to McCarthy, and McCarthy's campaign. Now, Hearst here is saying you're going too far with it. It's becoming too partisan. You need to let off the gas a little bit. You're going to scare people. And over again, and some of his last statements are, we're in danger of inflaming a war. In danger, and he should know because he did kind of spark an earlier war, right? So he's saying, he's kind of in tune. He cares about what's happening, but it's slipping from his control to be able to kind of put the genie back in the bottle. And look, they're trying to connect it to UFOs, right? And then there's the saying, he was in foresight. He saw the Russian threat many years out. Depending on how you see it, I would say it's a little overwrought, obviously, but that's 20/20 hindsight, right? For us, you can imagine what people felt at the time, when this was playing out. So, the world of the atomic bomb, is the reason why War of the Worlds comes back into popularity. Is that there are people who, and here's a letter to one of the Hearst papers saying, I think we did this. We made, whoever it is who's coming to visit us, they're coming because they think that we are going to destroy ourselves, or they're going to destroy the galaxy, something like that. So people are talking about wars getting beyond us. And also just the weirdness of the atomic bomb. If you read a lot about the physicists who experienced the first blast at Trinity, they were impressed by the heat and the size of the mushroom cloud, but a lot of them talked about it like they were looking at a new organism being formed. And the colors, it doesn't really play out here in these black and white photos, but the colors, blues and greens and purples and reds all kind of combined, and it's almost rather psychedelic, right? So this is from the 1953 version of War of the Worlds, and this is how it looks in the film, right? There's all of these very strange colors, because you've been pushed out of normality, right? You've been pushed into a completely different reality. You've crossed the line in it. And Carl Jung, who was very interested in the inner world, was saying maybe flying saucers. There may be a physical explanation for it, but there's also a psychological explanation. And people are projecting their fears of atomic bombs and their fears of the world's situation onto the skies. And maybe it's a sighting of jet planes that they've never seen before, or a strange cloud, or they read something and they let their imagination run away with them, or maybe they just see something that they have no point of reference or context for, and so all of these fears kind of go into that. It's an atomic hangover is what another letter writer to the Hearst newspapers called the flying saucers. So we're bombing ourselves in these weird demonstrations of American air power. So this is a Hearst newsreel. Mass bombers, which only a few years before were destroying Germany and Japan, are now flying over Chicago, New York, and LA. Like this guy's like, oh God, I don't know if I like that. These bombers flying over. This is a Cosmopolitan article saying that there could be a nuclear Pearl Harbor around the corner if we're not careful. So even though we have the bomb right now, within 2 years the Russians will have it, and then it's a whole different ballgame, right? So constant argument for air power, more air power, right? The U.S. Air Force was formed as a standalone agency at the end of 1947. Here's that ad for P-80 jets and early jets that are this is in the San Francisco, the LAX, the Los Angeles Examiner. So, and well, you're creating a new armed force in the sky. Might as well send them off of flying saucers, right? Give them something to do. Can you imagine these poor guys? Somebody saw something strange and they fly up and they all over the country, Chicago and LA, hours chasing ghosts, chasing mirages, chasing rumors. So, and look at the stuff that's in the sky. It's so strange. These experimental planes, the flying flapjacks. This is the flying wing. That's the first newsreel. That still looks futuristic to me. It still looks so strange. And that's the prop version. There will be within a year. Actually at the end of 1947. There's going to be the jet version of that as well too. So But over and over again, they're saying they maybe resemble these planes, but the Air Force is saying absolutely not. They're not us. They're not us. Until they say, well, maybe you're mistaken. More weird wings, right? I wish I had more time to go into this, but just know that Hearst had Howard Hughes's back. Hughes will write columns for the Hearst newspaper during this scandal that was going on about money being spent over the Spruce Goose, right? And there's some fascinating Hearst newsreels talking about the fight back and forth, and there's some political scandals, whether too much money is being spent on this type of thing. And in this one, Elliot Roosevelt, who actually had written, he was the aviation editor for the Hearst newspapers in the 30s, later on is attacking Hearst and Patterson in the Department Press for claiming that FDR encouraged Pearl Harbor, something like that. So there's all political scandals, 1947. Here's the reality, and here's all. Pretty close, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's all these pro Hughes articles. This one is Adela Rogers St. John's talking about how he's an eligible bachelor, an unmarried millionaire. Any woman would want him. So a lot more people are flying. Constellation comes out that year, kind of projecting what air travel will be like. But there's a ton of crashes happening as well too. Civilian crashes. There's military crashes as well. Even experienced stunt pilots. Tex Rankin is a very famous stunt pilot. He will be killed, and then a few weeks later, his son is killed in basically flying his other plane. And here they're talking about how in a week, 16 people have been killed in plane crashes. And Tex Rankin's brother has a UFO sighting. There's a UFO sighting over Bakersfield, supposedly before Kenneth Arnold's sighting. So that's number 25, and he describes them as being like the Navy's flapjack plane, which they only had one or two of, and it was basically mothballed by that point in time, but people trying to associate it. So let's go into the peak. Starts with Kenneth Arnold. Notice according to Blecker, he's not case number one. He's merely the first to kind of get famous off of it. He was a pilot. He was not a ranger, as the Hearst Press initially reported. What he was doing is he was looking for a downed aircraft near Mount Rainier, a military aircraft. He sold firefighting equipment, including these grenades, where you would throw them at a fire. So, they're called red comet grenades. I mean, comets and saucers, I don't know how those go together. But this is the very first story. He went to the FBI first, and their offices were closed. And so he walked across the street to the East Oregonian newspaper and said, I got a story for you. And he says, yeah, they were these crescent-shaped craft. They seemed to kind of fly together. They were weaving in and out of the peaks, Mount Rainier and otherwise. They were traveling, and he says they were about 1,600 miles an hour. Others, he corrects it to about 1,200 miles an hour. They spoke to him for 5 minutes. That's it. Spoke to him for 5 minutes. They published the story in the Oregonian, but they also put it out on the AP, and that's how it got into the public consciousness. And later on, he will write about it in many different forms. Fate magazine was one of the first. Ray Palmer was kind of a huckster who helped kind of goose the story along, and Arnold just will forever be kind of associated with the beginning of that. So, and then it's like I said, it's that peak, and you have all of these crazy different sightings. So this is Flight 105. Captain Smith and his co-pilot Stevens, and not her, she's a different stewardess, but the stewardess was on the plane, her name is Morrow. They all saw, I think, something like 9 to 10 discs. Not exactly, they're very clear, there wasn't exactly what other people were seeing. They seemed to be kind of like flat, almost coin-like in some ways. They had said that they were just joking about what if we see flying saucers. They were flying a DC-3, here's Hearst's DC-3, right, so it was a common commercial aircraft at that time. This picture is in Hearst paper after paper after paper. He was pointing at a hubcap, but it's like, that's what we saw. It looked just like that. And Hearst actually pays him to tell his story, which is rather interesting. He goes into a lot of detail. They were very much supportive of pilots and anybody who had kind of a military background and kind of talking about what they saw. So very, very famous sighting. Now we come to the Ryman photo. Another chap in uniform, he's Coast Guard, speed graphic camera, just like Ouija used, right? And his neighbors say, hey, get out here, I see something strange. And he runs out and he takes this photograph, and it is published. Well, he takes the photograph and then he runs over to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the Hearst newspaper, to print the photograph. So it's in the dark room there that the first UFO photograph is printed. So that's another connection, first for the Hearst media. Later, the Air Force said it was a weather balloon or a balloon of some type, but it did things, it moved in directions that a balloon wouldn't necessarily, it was going a lot faster, it was going several hundred miles an hour. And then you see it paper after paper after paper. There are other photographs that come out. This is one that was in Kentucky. Here's another one. I'll show you some more images of that's in Phoenix, although they printed it wrong, at least where it was originally taken. They stood it up on their side, probably just to fit it, you know, in the place where it could fit into the newspaper. But a lot of these, you see that there's this sound photo process that was invented by Walter Hough, who was a kind of a tech wizard for Hearst. And this is how they were getting it from one paper to another. Here's also the crew of Flight 105 and Kenneth Arnold, who had their first sighting, looking at Ryman's photo. Right? So they're all kind of bringing this kind of together in the ecosystem. So here's this is a different paper, but like I said, that photograph will turn up in the Hearst papers, you know, some saying, ufologists saying, this resembles a lot more what Arnold said he saw. Not a disc, but like a crescent kind of shaped thing, whatever it might be. This guy claimed that Men in Black showed up at his house and took his original negatives. Never saw them again. Right? So early story like that. So yeah, people are seeing them anywhere. I have so many of these. I mean, some of them are just really strange. This is a guy who saw USOs, undersea objects. He saw them plunge into the ocean near the San Francisco Bridge, and the Army officer there who was across the Presidio said, "Oh, they're just fireworks. It's just kids playing with fireworks," which is possible. You know, but if you've been primed, you know what you're going to be seeing. There's a woman who said that she saw a mama disc with babies flying in and around and almost being like gathered up like chicks hiding under a mother hen's wings. There's so many, the variety, the utter variety of these different sightings is really remarkable. Here's one from San Luis Obispo that was in the Slow Tribune, but also was in the LA Examiner, where they saw ghosts of saucers, strange swirling luminous clouds that kind of almost look like tornadoes in some ways, touching down. Heard a strange noise, and then it dissipated over time. And I like this part. This wasn't in the slow version of the story, but the Tribune version. But in the LAX, they're saying, we were afraid to say anything because they're making fun of people who are seeing these things. But when we all got together and we said, did you see it? I saw it too. So then they start sharing their stories. Authorities have no idea, right? They have one theory after another, after another, after another, right? So it's tied to atomic power, essentially that's nonsense, it's just mass hysteria. This comes up over and over again. It's blood spots. All you need to do is walk outside and look into the sky without blinking for a while, and you see things move across your eyes, and that's probably what people are saying. So it is planes, it's not planes. People are just drunk, right? Weather balloons, over and again. So you imagine, people make up stories when there isn't a story that lands with them, that makes enough sense. Hearst media is going to run and make illustrations, right? I like this. This is supposedly the pilot. One of these things, right? Yeah. There's an engineer who suggested that you could actually make these for real. And now we come to Roswell. So different sighting in the paper. Horrible killing. This is an Herald Express, of course. And the Army has found a flying saucer. Oh, but it's just a radar, weather balloon. Right? A few of the early Hearst stories, it's just treated as we found something and now we're going to study it. And this actually has kind of the halfway between that. But as it's kind of going to press, very quickly, the powers that be are saying, no, it's just a weather balloon. It's just a weather balloon. And so you see these images go. I love this. Flying disc found. Army. AL Stars win. Slightly bigger news than baseball. Just slightly bigger news. So, and over and over again, yes. Sorry that he reported seeing a saucer. Sorry that he he found one. It's very embarrassing. So this is really when things start to die. And this is the lone Hearst newsreel that mentions the phenomena in 1947. So it's not a full soundtrack, so you don't get the music and all of that, but you'll at least get the saucers. This is typical of the way that it will be talked about after the 8th, from the 8th forward.
I have examined all eyewitness reports from all over the country, and after numerous calculations, my figures are conclusive. Of all the items in our stock catalog, there is only one which would have the high velocity and low wind resistance of flying saucers. The cover of a GI trash can.
That would have been the story at the very end of the news report. So you get the real news, right? So, and then the hoaxers come out, kids pulling jokes, strange objects being, launched into people's yards. This is a priest in Chicago who wrote a book about tall tales told while fishing, and then goes to the newspaper and says, "But I promise this is not made up." Right? So I don't even know what to do with this. This is the first admitted hoax where somebody said that he crashed into a flying saucer, and then his boss made him call the papers the next day and confess to the hoax, because he was afraid that it was going to make people panic. Well, there were hucksters, back in the 1890s too. There's the airship. Who is it? It's Kris Kringle delivering toys to San Francisco department store. Hey, here we have some of the New York papers, Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Here it is. What are the discs? It's the coins you've saved by investing in this bank. Macy's has rushed a toy out. I'm sure they sold millions of them. 29 cents. They probably made a killing. Here it is. Hot dogs are the flying saucers. Those are the flying discs. People looking for houses, right? Rent gouging, right? This one's aimed at GIs, right? GI. It's the flying disc, and it's no myth, right? That you should buy a house in Compton, right? Sometimes there's no connection to the verbiage here. It's just flying saucers special. You're scanning the paper. What are you looking for? News about flying saucers? It might get your attention. It's used by evangelical preachers and whatnot. The flying saucer story, the truth about flying saucers, God and the flying saucers. Who knows what they were talking about? But there are some kind of quasi-religions that started around this time, combining science fiction and these ideas of science. So, and the papers themselves. The Chicago Hearst paper and the New York Hearst paper are the ones that take the most liberties. I think they sort of associate this with being kind of weirdo West Coast kind of thing. And there's always in the background this is a fear that the Europeans are going to be making fun of us somehow. So here, this is a guy who went to an amusement park in Chicago on a disc vigil. He's just waiting. He's a photographer for the Chicago paper, and he's just sitting there waiting for the saucers to go by and the parachute ride. Here they went on to one of the bridges in New York and just threw teacups and saucers off of the bridge and took a photograph. We finally got a photograph, right? So they're having a bit of fun with it. They're trying to puncture it. Here is Dick Calkins writes to the Chicago Herald American saying, "I know what the saucers are. I'm just doing some experiments for Buck Rogers, the strip that I draw, right? Which is being printed in the Hearst media, right? So, and this is where I think it gets really interesting because Hearst had an interest in, even to his very last, right, in making sure the comics looked right. Which one, by the way, is the one that's supposed to be? The one that he wanted it. Which looks better to you?
The horizontal.
Yeah, this is the one he said, it must be printed this way. Why did you print it that way, right? So at the same time that flying saucers and space stuff is interesting, Hopalong Cassidy is making kids swoon, right? So yeah. Hearst, the King Features strips are being packaged in the new form of comic books now. So these are on the stands in 1947. Flash Gordon, there's a Flash Gordon, there's another King Features property. This is a strip from 48 talking about flying saucers. And then we have the political cartoons. So there's Jess Cargill, who I think was in 450 different papers, including Hearst papers. These are all that money from the Marshall Plan coming over to save ruined Europe is what the Russians are saying, right? Quick, get the flip, right? Quick Molotov, get the flip. Clifford Berryman, he's still alive. He's one of the more famous political cartoonists. And here it's Dewey, is going to run for president in 48, and Truman's worried, right? Truman was actually asked, have you seen any flying saucers? And he said, only what I've read in the newspapers, right? So he's kind of referring to this as a newspaper thing. Anyway, Berryman is very famous for these two cartoons. This one is Remember the Maine, right? 1898, he would coin that phrase, right? And then this one, drawing the line in Mississippi, it was a joke on the faux heroism of Theodore Roosevelt, saying, I will not shoot that cub bear that you have staked to the ground. And if Berryman is the one that first draws it, and what comes out of this? The teddy bear. Right? Yeah. So he will die only a few years after this. But that's so fascinating, it's this kind of crossover moment. Somebody that stretches all the way back to the 19th century in the media. So Burris Jenkins is another one here. It's the Rising Prices. He does this cool, the Dream Team using all King Features comic strip characters. So if they played football. This one, so you can imagine her saying, okay, people who are interested in flying saucers, make it about high taxes and run with it. And so here's different interpretations, day after day in different papers and the different way that it looks, right? But my all-time favorite is this one, right? United Scrutiny of America, Paul Blashby. It's just people staring up. What is it? That's it. It really kind of captures the moment. It's like nobody, you don't know what it is, or what is it, but it captures the attention of the whole nation. So, okay, 1948. We'll do this quick. There are classic sightings. We won't really go into very much, but it does show that flying saucers have legs, right? It's not just a 1947 thing. This is another wave, very famous wave. They're called the classics by Ruppelt because he said these were classic examples of misidentification. He claims that each one of these events was just chasing weather balloons or skyhook balloons. But in 1948, there's the sighting, supposedly at the castle. I cannot verify this document. What good, would a UFO talk be without suspicious government documents? Chuck Walker supposedly found this in 2015 online and gave it to the library. It is not in the place that it used to be now, but you can find it in other places. First of all, this is impossible to read, or it's very, very hard to read. So that's supposedly the original. It's a photocopy of the original letter that was sent, supposedly on the stationery, right? There are discrepancies between as much of this that you can read, there's discrepancies between what the Air Force typed up and what was written in here. You could say it's a hoax, that was wrong, and that's a total possibility, But I also think it was, at the time, the Air Force was sick of these stories because the cranks came out of the woodwork, and so they probably weren't taking pains to be as exacting as they would. So this was, Andy was the one who identified this as Mark Patterson, who in Hatchett's in and around the castle. He's the night watchman who Hearst gives the fur coat to when it's cold, right? Go get a coat out of storage and you can use that. Well, he's only identified in some of these documents as MP and this and that, and in some other documents that I found elsewhere, they say M. Patterson, so we're pretty sure that this is Mark Patterson. One of the discrepancies between the two documents, in the typed one, whoever wrote this up, the officer wrote, he read about it in the San Francisco Examiner. I went to the San Francisco Examiner around that time. There are no saucer sighting stories, nothing like that. But in this, you can't barely read it, but basically what he says is, I saw it in the Post. this was probably what he was referring to. If this is an authentic document, this is a Saturday Evening Post story by Shallot. Basically just wrote what the Air Force, Project Grudge is the name of the project before Blue Book. It tells you a lot about their perspective, like get us away from this. And basically saying there's nothing to it and it's a waste of time. We're wasting our time chasing these phantoms in the sky when we really have other things that we need to be worried about, like the Russians, right? That type of thing. So get it out of your head. A lot of people read this and probably dismissed it from that. What I think is interesting is that Patterson reads this and he says, well, people are talking about it, and I did see something. I saw 16 of these discs fly in and out of these various peaks back here. So other things that he refers to, he writes the original letter not to the Air Force, but to Mark Clark. Mark Clark was a general during the Second World War, anti-communist, very strident anti-communist. He's the one who seized Rome, pretty much against orders, but he did it anyway. He was angry that money and support was going to be going to Stalin and yada, yada, yada. So he is being written about in the Hearst Press around this time because he's at the Presidio. He also wrote for the Hearst Press, wrote about communism and its dangers, the things that he observed when he was in Europe. So this is a known quantity. I don't know exactly why he would have written to him, other than he might have been in the paper, at that given time. And it seemed to be somebody that could be trusted, I suppose. So, here's where he says, that they were flying in and out. This is a PS here. There's a PPS at the bottom that I can't read at all, except for a few parts where it says, I saw something April 5th or 3rd, 1949, which is very, I don't know, that's, some of these government documents are incredibly washed out, so that's the best you're gonna get. So who knows what that PPS was about. But he apparently drew a little diagram here about where it happened, right? And if we kind of imagine it, going back there, supposedly. And he said, I didn't wake anybody up. There were people staying there, but it happened so late at night, like 11 or something like that, that I didn't want to wake everybody. And it happened so fast that there was nobody that I could actually bring to share the experience. So people he mentions, like Donald Springer, or at least in this document, are talked about in the Hearst Press. Mostly pouring cold water on UFOs and saying that this is not a thing. So you imagine how they would handle this story. There's another guy who worked with Rand, who's also, he basically writes a letter back saying thank you very much for submitting the report. Here's another document. That wasn't some of the ones that Chuck had submitted to the library. Here it mentions, and here it's in the clear. In those documents, his name is crossed out. It's only NP. Here it is, Patterson, right there. And it's just not enough information, right? Insufficient info. So they don't dismiss it as a hoax like they do in other cases or a misidentification. They just say we don't have enough information. But if you want, you could find this document at the Black Vault under the Project Blue Book cases from 47 to 58. So Walter Winchell is one of those who has tons of theories. He is a Hearst columnist for the Mirror. He also is on the radio, Mutual Network. Like I said, there was a partnership that the Hearst radio stations had. He comes out with tons and tons of theories, and some of them are just bananas. I want to read this one. See if I can find this theory. Is it here? No, it's in the next one. Ruppelt is talking about how he basically, out of the side of his mouth, saying is Winchell and others, but mainly Winchell, is really mucking things up because people start submitting stories, those crackpots that come out of the woodwork every time Walter Winchell starts talking about his theories about what flying saucers are. Hearst and him, he he let him run. He knew he was very popular, but every once in a while he would kind of jerk his leash because he was straying into quote unquote alien ideologies, alien ideas, talking about politics when he should be talking about gossip. That's what he was hired for initially. And of course, around this time, Walter Winchell is going to dive really strongly into anti-communism. So here he is saying it's maybe flying wing is what people are saying. By the way, bigger news than Princess Elizabeth getting engaged, right? So that's happened at that time. So here's a document. I think this is where he's informing on the UFO sighting people. They write to him because he's talking about it on the radio, and he will turn these documents over to the FBI because he was very friendly with J. Edgar Hoover. So, and sometimes like, do they have a point here? What's going on? This was a woman named Merchant who had a lot of bananas theories and very vague, seemed to be trying to get money to study flying saucers, and he's kind of passing these things along. So these are the FBI documents that you can find. So skip that. Where's Winchell's? Oh yeah, here's somebody from San Luis Obispo saying, can you promote our new product, Flying Saucer, on your program? I don't know if you ever did, but here it is, right, on sale. I looked it up. It was they sold like ranges, and they sold refrigerators and things like that. They're very close to, well, I think it's an apartment building right now. So I don't think they lasted for another year, but they probably had a lot of the stock. Just toys that they had to bring people into the stores, and they probably were stuck with dead stock, so they were just trying to sell it. And hey, he's talking about flying saucers, so maybe he'll promote us on his show. So here he is informing on Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not. Ripley says, hey, will you come on my show? We can talk about a Japanese flying saucer that I found. And I think he begs off and he sends this to Hoover and he says, is this real? Did they really find a flying saucer? And Hoover's agents are saying, as far as we know, we've not found any crash saucers. The crash saucer sightings or stories are starting to proliferate in the press. Japanese flying saucer sightings for the 1800s.
Pretty fancy.
Yes. It's a story from 1809, I want to say, where a floating ship that had strange people inside of it floated onto a beach in Japan. So they're still debating what that actually meant. A lot here. Winchell claimed many different things. So he claimed, oh, it's the Navy, or it's the Russians, or it's this, or it's that. He actually got into a fight with another reporter, and the reporter said, well, it's not the Russians, it's the Navy. And Winchell later on said, oh, I said that before, so even though I changed my story already, you're just agreeing with what I had said before, so I was always right. Here is these crash saucer stories end up in the strangest places. This is 1950. They're talking about popular music, and here the guy is saying, whatever I have to talk about lacks the punch of flying disc man, 23 inches tall, with large head found on the Mexican mountain. Like, it's just in the air. It's so weird. And the Roswell story eventually kind of takes on that. That is the crash, right? But it was associated with a lot of different sightings and a lot of different rumors that were happening at the time. I don't know where I have it. There is a story that Winchell runs with, and he says, look, I have the real scoop. What people are seeing is some advanced American aircraft that when the pilot flew so fast that he couldn't control it, he crashes, and when they dug him out of the wreckage, he was 18 years younger than he had been when he climbed in the cockpit. His teeth were different, all this kind of stuff. Like, where did this come from? It's so very strange. So, I mean, that's part of the world of gossip. And it gets into the comic books. Walter Winchell is parodied, Luella Parsons, and Drew Pearson. These are all people in the Hearst media orbit. And it's what kids, obviously their parents and whatnot were listening to these types of things. And the government is covering up stories about flying saucers. So it's coming full circle. Donald Kehoe. Kehoe, as I mentioned, writes the first story that was treating it as a real phenomenon. It eventually becomes a book in 1950. Here is a Hearst column talking about it. This is going to open up a whole new avenue of it. He's got a kind of very stern look there where he's on television talking about he will create a kind of a cottage industry. Just talking about UFOs, and creates an agency that is kind of pushing the government to release more and more information. But he started as a writer on aviation. He was a Marine pilot. He flew with Lindbergh. Very popular book. This is late 20s when this was published. He was a freelance writer, so he turns up in a lot of Hearst periodicals talking about spies in Washington. He wrote pulps. he wrote about a kind of a superhero during World War I who flew planes and would fight pterodactyls and all kinds of strange things. So it comes from this pulp world and then picks up on the flying saucers and what's actually going on. He writes about communism. And is hired again later on, even after he goes into UFOs. He's writing, an expose on what happened to Charles Lindbergh, the mystery of the enigma of this guy. So, Edwin C. Hill was one of the first announcers for the Hearst newsreels. I think the very first of the sound newsreels. Here he is giving Hough a thumbs up for his book, and here's the third book in his series. The fourth book is the Flying Saucer Conspiracy. NECAP is the agency that he sets up. And here he is being investigated by the FBI. The FBI is like, what does this guy actually know? And he seems to be a professional bomb thrower. He's a flamboyant writer. Much of his material is irresponsible. How do we know it's irresponsible? Referring to a 1941 cosmopolitan story about Hitler going to invade the United States. So anyway, so they're dismissing him. But maybe the biggest splash that he makes is his book suggested, it wasn't the basis necessarily completely, but it suggested the movie versus the flying saucers. Right? So, yeah. And here's Mr. Hough, and here are the aliens. There's kind of a similarity there, I guess. I love these images. This is the best part of the movie. Most of it is very dry. But when Ray Harryhausen's flying saucers start to take out Washington, D.C., I'm sure a lot of people were cheering, right? So that's 56. Here's 51. Hearst still around. This is a cosmopolitan story by Bob Considine, very similar to the Shallot story, saying there is no such thing as flying saucers. You're costing us money by studying this. Right? So yeah, by this point in time, fairly negative, but still running with it, still realizing that people are interested in it, still trying to get ahead of it, but it's kind of gotten away from it. Day of the Earth is still very literate. Flying saucer movie, science fiction movie from the early 1950s. Drew Pearson is in it, so Hearst columnist there. But the best of the best of them all derives from Who Goes There. Who Goes There, written by John W. Campbell. Have been reading about Admiral Byrd and his Antarctic expeditions. A lot of them were talked about in the Hearst newspapers. And will start those in the late 1920s, goes back several times in the 30s, and then resumes it again 1946, 1947. When he sits down for an interview with Lee Van Natta and says, the reason why I'm doing it now is because this is how we might be invaded. We might be invaded over the poles, right, either the North or the South Pole. There are all these rumors connected to flying saucers at this time that have gone back to an earlier science fiction piece about the Lemurians, the supposedly people who lived inside the Earth, and was in Astounding Stories, which will run with the Kenneth Arnold stories later on, but these were, again, in the air, folklore that kind of gets attached to flying saucers.
Can we just have a few more minutes?
Okay, yeah, I'll finish up. So, yes, 1951, this is made into the movie, the best of them, made into the Thing, written by Charlie Lederer at the same time that he is drafting, getting non-Hearst lawyers to draft a will to protect Marion and protect the Empire. He is writing this movie, and it continues to be probably the best example of flying saucer media. And the connections are kind of interesting. If you've seen it, it's an intelligent vegetable, basically. It's a space carrot that they talk about. It's very hard to destroy him. There's a Hearst story here about Mars. It's just one vast thinking vegetable. This is from 1912. So Hearst passed away in 1951. The Lubbock Lights is a major sighting that happens a few days later. So I'll just finish off with the end of Darius Green, right, at this flying machine. So we have room for a moral here, and it's just a moral: stick to your sphere. Or if you insist, if you have the right on spreading your wings for a loftier flight, the moral is to take care how you like. So, thank you.